what we heard as our New Testament reading was an account of the conversion of the Apostle Paul. Now, the Apostle Paul is believed to have written more books of the New Testament than anyone else. Of the 27 books in there, Paul is said to be the author of 13 of them. And when we first meet Paul in the book of Acts, he is holding the coats of the Jews who were stoning Stephen. Remember, the Jews stoned Stephen because he was preaching about Jesus. Then we see Saul going around to different towns, finding Christians, rounding them up, and having them put in prison. And one day he and a group of other men are on the way to the city of Damascus to do just that, round Christians up and put them in prison. And Jesus appears to him and asks him, "Why are you persecuting me?" Saul is struck blind. And Jesus told him to go to Damascus, and there he'll be told what to do. The men that were with him lead him to Damascus. A man named Ananias goes to Saul and tells him to take the message of Jesus to people. And so Saul receives his sight back, and Saul says, "Look, I can't preach to the Jews. Everybody around here knows that I used to go around putting Christians in prison." And so Jesus tells him, "Paul, I'm going to send you to the Gentiles." And it is Paul who the book of Acts says was responsible for understanding that Christianity and Judaism are two separate things. It is Paul who the book of Acts says realized that the message of Jesus is for all people and not just Jews. And then we see Paul taking the message of Jesus to various cities throughout the Roman Empire. And so you see what happened. When we first meet Paul, he's a Jew named Saul, and he's going around rounding Christians up, putting them in prison. And then Jesus appears to him one day on the road to Damascus. And from that moment on, nothing was ever the same. That experience Paul had on the road to Damascus when Jesus appeared to him changed everything. It made it necessary for him to reject all that he had ever believed before about God and the way God works. And he had to come up with new ideas. That's what's called a paradigm shift. Now, the term paradigm shift was first coined in 1952 by a physicist named Thomas Kuhn. He applied it to science, but it's since been applied to many different things. The word paradigm simply means the current and accepted way of thinking about something. The current accepted way of understanding something. The way we look at something. That's a paradigm. Yeah, the way we understand things. The way we think things work. A paradigm shift is a change in that. And a paradigm shift happens when something happens that makes it obvious that the way we understand something or the way we look at something is not right. You have one understanding of this, something happens, it's obvious this is not right, so you have to change to a new understanding. A paradigm shift only happens in response to something that makes it clear that the way you used to look at things is not valid. Now, Paul's experience of Jesus appearing to him on the road to Damascus created a paradigm shift. It was that experience which caused him to rethink everything. Paradigms are deeply ingrained within us, and we do not change them easily. It takes something momentous to change a paradigm. A good example of a paradigm shift within Christianity relates to how our solar system works. For many years, people believed that the earth stands still while the sun and moon and stars move across the sky. And you can't blame people for thinking that. Because if you stand out there, the sun certainly does appear to move. And you stand out there, there's a certain time of year and sometimes when the moon is just right, you can stand on our front porch and the moon will come up way over the top of this soybean field over there and it'll look like it's that humongous. And you can stand there on our front porch and watch that moon come up, and it comes up so fast it almost looks like it's flying. Almost looks like you're looking at an airplane, and as it comes up, it gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and it goes up and back. And that happens really, really fast. Really fast. And so you cannot blame ancient people for believing that the earth stands still while the sun and moon and the stars move across the sky. You could say, well, the earth is hurtling through space at so many 100,000 miles an hour, and you'd say, well, you're crazy. Here I'm sitting here, I'm not hurtling through space at some humongous speed. The earth stands still. So it was obvious. If you didn't believe the earth stands still while all this other stuff moves, just go out and stand there and look. You can prove it. And so that's what people believe. Christians also believed that too and accepted it. And they interpreted the Bible according to that paradigm. Psalm 19 says, talking about the sun, its rising is from one end of heaven and its circuit to the other end. And people interpreted that verse as saying that the earth stands still while the sun moves. After all, that was the only way you possibly could interpret it. It had to be like that. Because everybody knows the earth does stand still while the sun moves. So that's got to be the way it is. There was no other way to look at it. We knew it was that way. Now, Christianity has always been, organized Christianity has always sort of been like a little puppy dog following along at the heels of society, and goes everywhere society goes, and it takes whatever attitude society has at the time. That's always done. And so over the years, the idea that the earth stands still became a part of official Christian thinking, official Christian doctrine. And when scientists came up in the 1500s and the 1600s and started saying, no, wait a minute, the earth moves and spins, and that's what just looks like all that's moving, the church labeled it as heresy. A heresy is just a belief that doesn't agree with what the church says. In fact, in the 1600s, they put a scientist named Galileo on trial for saying that the earth revolves around the sun. They convicted him and sentenced him for the rest of his life to house arrest. Now, eventually, the old idea of the earth standing still got replaced by the idea that the earth revolves around the sun, and that became the accepted thing. And of course, Christianity followed right along with that, you know. When society changed, so does organized Christianity always change with it. And so the Catholic Church eventually accepted that the earth revolves around the sun, and they changed the way they interpreted certain Bible verses to accommodate that new understanding. Now that was a paradigm shift within official Christianity, and it did not come easy. It came only after several hundred years. And that's an illustration of how paradigms are so deeply ingrained with us, it takes a tidal wave to move them. You've literally got to be knocked off your feet and flat on your back before your paradigm is going to change. Evidence that they are wrong, that this paradigm is wrong, has to be like an avalanche. And that's what we saw happening in the Catholic Church with the earth revolving around the sun. Eventually, it was something they could not deny. So that paradigm shift happened. There's a good example in the Bible of a paradigm shift not happening. And we heard that, part of that, in our gospel reading. The Jewish leaders came to Jesus asking for a sign. Now remember, the Jewish leaders thought that they, out of all the people in the world, were the only people who understood about God. They were the only people in the whole world. And they alone knew the truth about God. They knew the truth. And here comes Jesus. And he's telling them they're wrong. Well, if you're sure you know the truth, and somebody comes up and tells you you're wrong, how do you look at them? An enemy. If I know the truth about God and somebody else comes over here and says something different, they're an enemy. Not my enemy, but God's enemy. You see, they knew Jesus was wrong. He had to be. because they knew the truth. And if Jesus said something contrary to what they said, he had to be wrong. And so they could not accept a paradigm shift. In the Gospel of Matthew, we see two groups of Jewish leaders, the scribes and Pharisees. They're at odds with Jesus from the beginning. They ask for a sign, and Jesus tells them, you've been given a sign. You've been given all the signs you need. If you can't see it, it's your fault. They were blind. Their paradigm that they had blinded them so that they could not see. The result of them not being able to change their paradigm was that they killed Jesus. We see another example of people in the Bible who could not change their paradigm in the disciples. Now remember, the disciples had been with Jesus throughout his earthly ministry. They had seen him crucified. They had seen him rise from the grave. They had seen him ascend into heaven. They had witnessed all this stuff, and this was a paradigm shift to them up to a point. But this also illustrates how deeply paradigms can become ingrained to where we just can't change them. You see, they had been raised within a Judaism that was exclusive. God was the God of the Jews, and only the Jews. God was for the Jews, and that's all. Nobody mattered but them. You see, that was their paradigm. But here comes Jesus. The gospel is for everyone. Remember, Jesus told the disciples to go out and spread the gospel to everyone. The disciples had a hard time accepting that. In Acts, Peter has a vision that the gospel is for everyone. And he accepts it at first. But his paradigm is just so strong. It's so deeply embedded that he goes back to his old ways. And what the disciples really finally came up with was, okay, well, maybe the gospel of Jesus is for everyone, but if you're going to become a Christian, you've got to follow all the Jewish laws. And that was the big split in Christianity. They had the big fuss with the Apostle Paul over that. Paul insisted, no, that is not the gospel. So paradigms can be so deeply ingrained within us that we change them only when momentous events prove them wrong. Sometimes these momentous events happen all at once. Sometimes they happen little by little. Sometimes paradigm shifts never happen, even in the face of momentous happenings. We saw that with the Jewish leaders. We saw it with the disciples. No matter what happened, they just could not change their paradigm. Paradigms are addictions. They're what we've always heard, what we've always believed, what we've always been told, what we've always thought. And they seem so reasonable, so obvious. Can you really blame people 1,000 years ago for thinking that the earth stands still and the sun and moon and stars move across the sky? Go out there and stand there and look. Does it feel like you're moving? You're standing still. It's obvious. Any idiot can tell you're standing still and see that moving there. Scientific proof. Fall down on your knees. So paradigms are what we've always heard. They're reasonable. They're obvious. And that's why they're so hard to change. That's why sometimes we're just not able to let them go. We hold on to them and hold on to them even though we know we should change it. We just can't change them. It's like an alcoholic that can't quit drinking. They just can't do it. It's easy to look back on the past and criticize the people of the past for not changing their paradigm. We wonder why in the world they couldn't see that what they believed is so stupid. And why it took them so long. We look back on those Catholics from the 15 and 1600s and say, well, those people are stupid to convict a man for saying that the earth stands still while the sun and the moon, well, for saying that the earth revolves around the sun. We have our paradigms too, we just don't think we do. I think one of the most dangerous things about the modern world is the fact that we think we do not have paradigms anymore. Paradigms are what people used to have. Not us, though. We have truth. We live in the scientific age. We no longer depend on paradigms. We depend on scientific facts. We look back at the people of the past who had paradigms and we sort of feel sorry for them. We excuse them because we realize, hey, after all, they were stupid, they were dumb, they didn't have scientific facts. We're the first people in all of history who've ever understood anything. All anybody that came before us ever had was supposition, superstition, old wives' tales. We're the first people in history that have ever known truth. All the people before us were just mired in legends and myths, but not us. We've gone beyond paradigms. We have truth. And so when we look back in history, we do it smugly. People back then needed paradigm shifts. They were just too stupid to realize it. We don't, though, today. We have truth. We don't need a paradigm shift. We're not the only people that have ever lived in history who were absolutely sure that they finally come up with truth with a capital T. One of the darkest periods in Christian history is something called the Inquisition. The Inquisition was a Roman Catholic tribunal for the discovery and punishment of heretics. And heretics are simply people who have beliefs that are different from what the church says. The incarnation began in the early 1200s. And it didn't take it long to where it was in full swing throughout Central and Western Europe. The Inquisition actually came to this continent and was active in Mexico and South America. And it lasted until the late 1700s before it was finally disbanded. Horrible tortures and executions, burnings at the stake, and other cruelties were rampant. Tens and tens of thousands of people were tortured and horribly killed because they were accused of holding beliefs not in line with official church teaching. And so we think for a minute, how in the world could people who were supposedly followers of Jesus Christ be so cruel? How could they do it? Because they were convinced they had truth with the capital T, and anyone who did not hold to their beliefs was therefore an enemy. Don't we have segments in our society today who believe they are in possession of truth with a capital T and view those who do not agree with them as the enemy? Wasn't one segment of American society declared war on this very week? Think back on the past year and a half. There's a lot of similarity between the Inquisition period and the way we live today. We just haven't gotten to the burning at the stake point yet. But don't be surprised if it comes. We look back on people 1,000 or 2,000 years ago and found it hard to understand how they believed like they did. I was reading an article in a book the other night. It's talking about people used to think tomatoes and potatoes were poisonous. And it took decades for potatoes to be accepted as a food because people were convinced they'd kill you. It would be like drinking cyanide or something. We look back at people and say, well, how stupid can you be? But people 1,000 or 2,000 years from now look back at us and say, how in the world did they believe some of that stuff? You see, our scientific understanding of things is not as complete as we think it is. We have not reached the apex of understanding we think we have. No one's ever thought they needed a paradigm shift. Only when experience leaves us no choice. Only when the tidal wave knocks us off our feet or the avalanche buries us in snow and we have to crawl out. Only when it leads to disaster do we finally have a paradigm shift. If the way we understand things now and the way we go about things now is leading to disaster, leading to things that do not work, do we really have to wait until the tidal wave has swept us all away until we consider a paradigm shift? Do we really need to wait until it's too late before we consider a paradigm shift? Just remember something. Remember how clear it seemed to ancient people when they went out and stood at night and they watched those stars and the moon go across the sky and they watched the sun come up there. Remember how obvious it was to them that the earth stands still while the moon, sun, and stars move. Any idiot could have seen that, couldn't they? But yet it was dead wrong.